Okay, we have another question from Phil. What is the difference between anchoring and conditioning? Okay. Well, they're different labels, of course, for something very similar. Anchoring, if you're familiar with NLP, you'll know the term anchoring. It's like anchoring one thing with another, associating one thing with another. And conditioning is basically the same. You're associating a particular response to a particular trigger. Trigger, response. Very common in behavioral therapy in the 50s, for example, 1950s, very common. Anchoring is a similar thing to that. You're associating one thing with another. Now, I was asking myself the other day, why every time I go to have a shower, I'm standing under the shower and singing a Bob Dylan song. And try as I can to not do it. Every time I walk in the shower, I start singing this Bob Dylan song. Now, I have no idea why it's a Bob Dylan song. It's not related to getting wet or a shower, but somehow in my history, I've associated this song with that context. And I think the fact that I'm aware that I'm doing it reinforces the actual conditioning, if you like. Now, it's a crazy thing that two should go together. Okay. And I've tried not to do it, but of course, if you have to be aware that it might happen beforehand in order to block it. And usually I'm not thinking of the song until I'm actually under the shower and it's too late. Okay. So I may be doing that for the rest of my life. I don't know, but there's an idea. It's an example of classic conditioning. Okay. And so anchoring, similar kind of thing. So it's similar. I suppose the main difference is how we apply it. In NLP, you'll be using anchoring maybe for accessing a resource or a certain emotional feeling. Let's say you're touching your client on the shoulder every time they feel confident about something. This is often something you'd use in NLP. Okay, so accessing a resource. The idea is that eventually that touch is going to trigger the confident feeling. Now, the only problem with that, of course, is you need to use a lot of repetition and have a very strong emotion and a kind of an obvious touch because they're not in trance. But when you're using hypnosis, it can be much more subtle. It can just be suggested, like every time I touch you on the shoulder, you'll feel this way. And because hypnosis is like an adhesive, it makes that suggestion stick more effectively. So you need a context which is trance-like in order to make this work. If the emotion is something that in NLP, is something that puts people into trance when they remember it or experience it, then, okay, that's possible. But it depends on the trance component of it. Many years ago, I was invited to Ireland to spend a week with the seventh son of a seventh son healer. And his girlfriend was a beauty queen. She was a beauty queen, Miss Ireland, okay. And so we went to dinner one night. As a whole group of us went to dinner one night. And she was one of these girls who had this very obvious laugh that people found funny. Okay. So I was sitting next to her here, just on this side. And every now and then someone would say something funny and she would laugh. Now, I'm very aware when people laugh at a joke, they're not in a normal state. They're in an altered state. And you could say it's a trance state because they're not thinking of what's outside that reality of that trance state that's making them laugh. Shock, surprise is another couple of examples. This here was humor. And so what I did every time she laughed with this silly laugh, I just got my spoon and I went on the wine glass, ding, okay, very subtle, ding. I did this, I don't know, remember 20 times, every time she laughed at something, and it was very, very subtle. It wasn't really obvious. But then later, of course, being a little bit naughty, as I am sometimes, when she wasn't laughing, I'd just go ding, and she burst out laughing every time. And she didn't even realize why she was laughing. But of course, the place became in hysterics because like she's spontaneously laughing, and I'm just going ding like this. So this is very kind of classic conditioning, anchoring. So they're basically the same. The other difference, except one uses trance much more than the other. The other difference is that, with conditioning in hypnosis, we use that as part of what we call post-hypnotic suggestions. When you give a post-hypnotic suggestion, you're suggesting that something will happen later in the person's life after they've come out of hypnosis. Okay, like at a certain time, for example, a trigger, certain time. The more subtle it is, the better, actually. Not something too obvious, but something that's likely to happen anyway. At a certain time, the client will do ABC or whatever. Okay. Or it can be something more direct, like every time I touch you on the shoulder, from now on, you're going to go back into hypnosis when we're in an appropriate context for you to experience this. So you're contextualizing it, of course, making it ethical and safe. Because it's post-hypnotic, it happens later, and it's done in trance, it happens later. So this is going to be more effective than the way it's used in NLP. So that's basically the difference, conditioning and anchoring. They're the same thing, but used in a slightly different way, and a different context, and with a different component, which is the obvious trance component.